Well, Jared and Nicole, Arizona is one of only a handful of states that does not have a lieutenant governor for now. Currently, it's the Secretary of State that would assume the role of governor if that person dies, resigns, or is impeached, but that will soon change.
The sprint to the midterms is officially on, with high-profile state races like Attorney General, Secretary of State, and Governor all on the ballot. And for the very first time, a lieutenant governor.
In 2022, the voters passed Proposition 131 that created this new position of lieutenant governor.
Tom Collins is the executive director of the Arizona Clean Elections Commission and says this new position was born from previous experiences in Arizona.
So the voters voted, say, for a Democrat to be governor or a Republican to be governor. Something happens, and now the governor is a Democrat or a Republican, right? That causes a whole change of government that voters may not have necessarily anticipated and may not want.
The stakes are high. 5 Arizona governors have left office early in the last 50 years. But both campaigns will likely play politics with their picks.
Do no harm is sort of the first rule of thumb, I think, on these selections. And it'll be interesting to see who they select.
Adam Kinsey is a political strategist and believes the 2 major campaigns for governor will have different approaches. For Governor Katie Hobbs,
she needs to just select somebody who doesn't make a lot of waves, frankly.
And for Republican nominee Andy Biggs,
he's got to get voters to forget how extreme he is.
Similar to Vice President, the lieutenant governor will show up on the ballot as part of the ticket for governor. But that person will also have a role once elected.
The law says that we want the lieutenant governor to do something. So they have to have some kind of administrative role, which the governor will pick for them.
Now, neither Biggs or Hobbs have announced a lieutenant governor pick yet. Both campaigns have until September 4th, or 60 days before the general election, to do so. For now, reporting live in Phoenix, Prelutsky for Arizona's Family.